Hi everyone, my name is Vanessa Valiuco and welcome to Personal Pans, conversations about belief, transformation, and all the weird things that we experience. Today's guest is Dr. C.S. Matthews, otherwise known as Professor WHAM. She's been teaching in a college setting for 35 years, and she also wrote her dissertation about ethnic and racial tropes, narratives, and aspects of UFO abductions in the US. This episode is going to be different from others. It's less a conversation and more of a primer on fascism, white supremacy, and anti-Semitism in the history of UFO cases, and also just in what I love, she has this term called Paraweird, white supremacy in Paraweird spaces. This has been a problem for as long as there has been a Paraweird space. And I think we need to know the roots of it in order to identify what is going on now, call it out, and hopefully do something about it. The drive for disclosure, the drive for information is causing a lot of people to overlook some really problematic stuff. And I think as a community, we have to not stand for any of that. So grab a pen and paper. Or whatever you use to take notes. I literally was taking notes the entire time she was talking. And I hope you enjoy this lesson in fascism and white supremacy in Paraweird spaces from Professor WHAM. Yeah, if you could just explain to the audience who you are, and I guess your interest seems like a weird word about the topic, but your focus, I guess, on this.
I know what you asked me to come to talk about. So,
yeah.
I am called Professor WHAM by lots of different people in the Paraweird community. I'm also known as Dr. C.S. Matthews because I wrote a book about paranormal experiences in the Hudson Valley. I do have a PhD in American Cultural Studies with a focus on, I focused on the ethnic and racial tropes, narratives, and aspects of the alien abduction narrative in the United States. I wrote this over 20 years ago now. I seem to have been prescient because it's only been in the last 3 years that I've been glommed by people asking for my dissertation. Obviously, it did not help my job prospects. I also have a graduate degree in religious studies. So a lot of my research time has been spent looking at the relationships between new religious movements, conspiracy theories, their intersection with paranormal communities, and how that plays out with different kinds of racial or ethnic tropes, identities, things like that. I've actually written some stuff on what we're going to talk about tonight, which you specifically asked me to talk about or for us to discuss, the issue or problem of white supremacy in Paraweird communities and its relationship, obviously, white supremacy's relationship to fascism. Those are fairly large topics, and they seem very specific. But as you indicated in our pre-recorded conversation, the roots of these things go back really, really far. And so, there were a number of different ways that I could have approached this in approaching this topic. So I guess what would be helpful for me, because, I've assembled as I often say with Stephanie Quick, I've assembled a pile of crap. So it's like, which part of this pile do we begin with? So I always, ask me questions and I will attempt to address them one way or another.
And I appreciate that because, again, as I mentioned before I hit record, I appreciate the fact that you have this breadth of awareness of white supremacy in general, the historical root of it, in a deeper way than I do, because for me, so my background is in sociology, and so I see the ways in which all of these things are connected, right? Sociology and women's studies, understanding intersecting systems of oppression. And so whenever, because I'll see this periodically on Twitter where someone will say, well, I just want to study magic, or I just want to study Bigfoot. I don't want to get politics into that. Not realizing that the privilege of thinking that you are outside of politics, it is such a strange thing to me. Like the politics of the world have everything to do with how I get to live my life and even how I get to inhabit my body. So that just a lack of awareness kind of is staggering to me.
Well, right. Well, what I always like to, when I talk about politics with my students, because I do teach or have been teaching a introductory class to the social sciences in a community college setting for, I don't know, it seems like 70,000 years now, but I've been teaching at least part-time, occasionally full-time. I do a different job entirely now, how I make my money, but for probably 35 years, I've been teaching at the college level and have taught in a variety of settings. But what I tell people is like, well, of course there's politics. As soon as you get two human beings together, you have politics, because all politics is a way by which power is negotiated and communicated. That's all it is. And I mean, I know that there was Aristotle's definition of politics, and I don't care about Aristotle because he's dead, and he was wrong most of the time. So, I mean, not all the time, but most of the time. And he was even more obnoxious than I am. So, for me, politics is just simply what it is when different groups of people try to figure out how they're going to live with each other, because differences occur. You have politics in a family, you have politics between friends, and I'm not talking about political positions. I'm talking about ways in which power is negotiated and communicated, and that's it. It's really no more. It's no more complicated than that. Obviously, once you develop large systems that people live in, then there are all of these different levels at which you have to negotiate. I think that probably one of the best people to describe this without even talking about Paraweird stuff, although he actually ends up venturing into some odd things, is David Graeber, who I don't know if you've heard of him. He passed in the spring of 2020. You spell his last name Graeber, and he was both an anthropologist and a historian of economic systems. And he proposes a different way of understanding how human societies organize. And the book that for me was the most important book that he wrote, although they posthumously have published another thing he was working on, but the one that I really recommend is called Debt, the First 5,000 Years. I think even though it's an economic history, quote unquote, it's actually about politics, and it's actually about the ways in which human societies figured out over time how to organize themselves around resources. And even though he picks apart a lot of different things and uses a lot of different examples, he's not overly critical of anything. He doesn't think religion is stupid, for example, like a lot of Marxists do, or even capitalists do, despite their use of it. He doesn't think that he doesn't espouse capitalism or socialism because, as he points out, these are both economic systems that have their roots in Western social contract theory. So they're both basically versions of one thing.
Yeah.
And the fact that they're, we've posited them as warring against each other just means that, the West hasn't figured out a solution for its own canard yet, and that other civilizations and other groups have had all kinds of different ways of organizing political life and economic life and things like that. He doesn't come to a solution in this book. He basically just says, listen, the only lie that you've been told is that there's only a few ways to do things. The fact is that there are infinite ways to do things. And we just, it's basically politicians and advertisers who have taught us differently. And all you need is to have a sense of what has happened in the past to understand what is available now. We're just lacking in imagination. Because we've been, as sociologists, we're kind of brought up to fit into these, little boxes that we're supposed to live in, and those little boxes are they're operative whether you're an occultist or a paranormal investigator or just some poor dude on the street or all of the above. I guess you could be. It's a matter of being able to see yourself within a context and then try to imagine yourself outside of that box. It's not easy to do, but with information, you can begin the process of doing that. And that's all that he really does. He was so vilified despite the fact that he had students loved him and he had this huge arsenal of publications, he couldn't get tenure anywhere in the United States because he didn't fit in the little boxes. I mean, anybody that thinks that the American Academy is a bastion of liberalism, I don't know what planet literally they're from, but I've never experienced it that way. But anyway, so I always recommend him.
Yes.
Because he just introduces this idea that, and he uses a lot of stuff from nature, it's kind of like, one of the things that the West has done, and this can get us into the racial thing. Mm-hmm. One of the things that the West has done in its attempt to sort of categorize and kind of control everything is that, we've tried to reduce biological systems and human beings, at least at one point. I mean, I think that there are some people that are changing that now, but at least at one point, like in the 18th and 19th century, the whole point of the Enlightenment and the idea of progress was that eventually we'd have all this crap figured out. I don't know what I'm supposed to say and not say in this, so
you talk about whatever.
What expletives I'm supposed to use and not use.
All of them, whatever.
Okay.
It's a safe space.
Okay. That's well, I mean, I'm on a radio podcast where we can't say the F word, so
sure,
because it's it's broadcast out to FM stations. But anyway, the whole idea was if we could find a way of categorizing things. That's that's where the taxonomies of the races came from,
right?
In the by Linnaeus and then other racial evolutionists, of whom, by the way, Darwin was not one. Mm-hmm. He's often blamed for it, but he in fact was not that. Mm-hmm. And if we can get everybody into these little categories and understand them, then we can maybe control them. We can predict their behavior. We can, it's just sort of this Western obsession with control. And trying to sort of rein in this really large, unwieldy thing that is called the human species and the planet itself. In fact, I kind of think of, when I think of Francis Bacon and his method of wanting to, put nature on the rack and torture her for her secrets, which is something that he talks about in the Nova Morganum, something that, you know, he wrote back, I don't know, it was 17th century, I don't remember, one of these old dudes, you know. When I think about that now, it seems to me like a real interesting magical operation. And the fact that he was writing at about the same time, you know, he was in the Elizabethan court, or he was associated with the Elizabethan court. He had to keep running to France because he was gay, and that was punishable by death. But, you know, he was writing in the Elizabethan court at the same time that John Dee was there, you know, and there was this kind of like a little mini renaissance of occult stuff going on. And it always makes me kind of wonder whether that was sort of his answer to occult work, was the scientific method as he described it, you know, which consisted of, you know, slicing and dicing nature into little bits, you know, to try to see how it worked, which of course you're never going to see how it works as a whole if you do that.
Yes.
But anyway, you know, Western science has, you know, and then of course, not Galileo, Isaac Newton was an alchemist, you know, Western science has about it, historically, has about it a kind of mystical quality, this kind of search for a truth that can get you sort of the grail, the you know, the golden thing that is going to fix everything. I mean, I think most scientists now don't necessarily believe that,
right?
But certainly the public still does. Or because science is just a human thing and it reveals itself as being fallible and subject to political squabbling, which is what the whole COVID thing has shown us, makes other people feel disaffected by it, you know, and then they start believing in crap like the flat earth and, you know, all that weird stuff, you know. It's kind of like, it's this weird sort of adolescent, well, if it doesn't work here, then it's all wrong. It's so bizarre. When I think of how immature American cultures are about this kind of stuff, I just don't even know what to say. But anyway, race fits into this, yes, because race, as you know, one of the first people to talk about race and to actually explicitly join race, for example, the idea of race with the idea of extraterrestrial exploration or speculation, I guess, was Kant. Immanuel Kant. He wrote an essay in which he speculates based on the different types of humans that he has heard about. He hasn't seen them all, but he's heard about them, you know. What people on Venus might look like, or people on Mars might look like, or, you know, so he speculates on this. And of course, you know, I mean, his taxonomy is stupid, you know. For him, it's like the reason why Hottentots, and those are Black people, you know, anybody from Africa was a Hottentot. The reason why Hottentots are dark is because they're closer to the sun, they get burnt. You know, so of course he doesn't understand, you know, lots of things, but, you know, the point is that he's joining the idea, he's speculating about, you know, what extraterrestrials might look like based on what he thinks is going on with humans. And of course, you know, he thinks that people in the northern climes are superior to people who are getting burnt because, well, I don't know, because I guess it's more temperate in the north. I don't know. You know, I mean, you read him now and you're like, okay, dude, that's wrong. But anyway, so, you know, so that's sort of like, that's how it went. And, you know, if you want to do like a really quick and dirty history of all this, you know, through the 19th century, you have all of these different thinkers, scientific thinkers, occult thinkers, spiritualist thinkers, all trying to answer the question of why there are so many different types of people. which of course for us now, we're like, well, that's kind of a dumb question. But anyway,
Yeah.
I mean, but it wasn't dumb for them because there were empires at stake. And there were some really, there are some really definite differences in culture between people. And there are a few, they're not high level biological differences, but, there are a few interesting variations of humans, now that we know that, some of us have Neanderthal and some of us, now we know how complex that whole DNA heredity thing is, so there are some distinct, biological clusters and stuff. But for them in the 19th century, this was, trying to figure this out was kind of the issue of the hour. And so people came up with different ideas. People who were more scientifically oriented, like Darwin, for example. For him, these were just different variations. Now he did not actually, I'm sure but not all your listeners may know that he did not coin the phrase survival of the fittest. That was coined by a journalist, Huxley, I believe it was, in the 1840s, and later editors joined that to later editions of Darwin's work. So that they became sort of, Darwin never liked that because that's not, that implies progress, survival of the fittest, that implies progress. And he was saying, no, these variations are random variations that occur. People often also don't understand that the initial objection, especially in the United States, that people had to Darwin did not have to do with the fact that, or the idea that that natural selection was an atheistic process, but rather Darwin clearly implied that Black people and white people and people of all these different colors and types were one species. He clearly implied that, and that really upset a lot of people. Right. So kind of in contrast to that, you have these other racial theories that develop, some of which have what we would call extraterrestrial connections. One of these, of course, is the theosophical idea of root races, which was developed in actual opposition to Darwinism. I mean, Blavatsky and her progeny, actually really did not like Darwinism because to them or those kinds of theories, because to them those theories seemed to be too not directed enough, too open to chance, so to speak. Sure. And so the idea of the root races gives you a sense that there are these different groups of humans, but their evolution is being directed by some type of interior spiritual force over the course of many, epochs or ages or whatever. So you do have a kind of evolution there, but it's a directed evolution. And then you had other interesting variations of this, like what you have in the Oahspe book, which is kind of like, I don't know if you're even familiar with that. A lot of people aren't, but it was written by or channeled or whatever by John Bellow Newbrow, a Cincinnati dentist who figured out, I'm sorry, it just cracks me up, who figured out how to use the newly invented typewriter for what is it? Automatic
writing, yeah.
And so he created this really interesting manuscript, which actually is interesting. It has some interesting things in it. It has some kind of startling things in it. But he basically tells an entirely alternative history of the Earth. And he's answering both. He's critical not only of Darwin, but also of theosophy. So, and he's a spiritualist. So he's kind of doing double duty there, but he also has been influenced by what's his name? Andrew Jackson Davis, the great spiritualist of the 19th century, who and in so doing, he believes that these directing forces, and argues that these directing forces are actually extraterrestrials. He calls them Etherians, and they come down and they are helping to direct the evolution of several different types of species. I mean, his approach was a little bit different. He was like, well, you know, God, who he calls Jehovah, what a weird thing. But anyway, God, if there are any Orospians in the audience, they're going to hate me because I just think of the names that he picks. It's like, these were just obvious misspellings, you know. But anyway, and they're just going to hate me for not being fair to their religion. But, you know, from his perspective, there were several distinct races that were formed. God originally did not want them all to mix, but now they've all mixed. So, oh, well, we can't unmix them now. So we'll just have to figure out how to live together in harmony. That's essentially, which to me is wonderfully practical, you know, and as part of that, you know, I mean, in some ways, you know, I mean, he decried, you know, he was an abolitionist. He decried Jim Crow laws and the ways in which colonial folks treated indigenous people. He wrote this really, really bad novel about that. You know, I mean, it's like a terrible novel. You try to read it, and you're like, this is crap. You can still find copies of it at the Library of Congress. Why they've kept it, I don't know. But you know, but he is incensed by the way in which white people had treated indigenous people. So you know, so automatically, you see, there's a political thing here. You know, the way we see each other, the way we understand our origins, does affect how we see ourselves politically. I mean, it just does. It just does, because it's where we get our identities from.
Right.
It's how we create our sense of self. I mean, you know this as a sociologist. It's how we create our sense of self, how we learn how to talk to each other, how we learn how to be with each other. But and then with throughout the late 19th century into the early 20th century, you have a series of what I call occult speculative fiction books. Probably the two most famous are The Dweller on Two Planets, or The Coming Race, you know, by Bulwer Lytton, which got picked up by certain groups, not so much German Nazis, but American Nazis. Even though I don't think either one of those books is explicitly racist in the manner that we now may mean, because of the language that's used in them, and because of the white privilege of the authors who are writing, who are appropriating Tibetan things or Egyptian things, or you know, whatever they're doing, it's very easy for subsequent people to use that material for their own purposes. And those are things that very explicitly join certain kind of racial ideas with extraterrestrial ideas, and certain occult ideas. All those things are sort of blended together. You know, now these are separate from fascism. You know, I mean, I know we talked about defining what fascism is, and just fascism is a political philosophy. It's a political ideology that, even though we associate it with Germany, it actually developed first in Italy, and it was first described by Mussolini. And it's a very specific kind of political ideology that came out of the problems of the new industrial nations in the late 19th and early 20th century. It was actually seen by many as an adequate solution to some of those problems, which are intractable. You know, the English response is utilitarianism. You know, the continental response is fascism, among other things. You know, to some of the same problems. What distinguishes fascism from, say, just right-wing stuff is that fascism it's a hyper-nationalism. it sees the nation, it tries to attend, and Mussolini's pretty specific about this. It tries to organize the nation and of course the government, which is going to control the nation, as a kind of cult. It's a kind of personality cult. And to this end, all of the economic forces of the state are going to be bent to the service of the state, which automatically means, so it's not free enterprise. The only reason why fascists have been able to ally themselves with capitalists is because most capitalists aren't really capitalists. If they haven't, I've yet to read, I've yet to meet, a laissez-faire capitalist who has actually read Adam Smith. And they're basically people that are just out for money. They're crime syndicates. And in fact, that's kind of what Mussolini is describing, is the state, the nation state, is a kind of cult syndicate. And it operates sort of like the mafia does. He uses the mafia as kind of a guide there. And so you have a charismatic leader at the top of it. And they are the ones who are going to, through their minions and all that economic activity, control the rest of the population through fear. But you don't want to just control them by fear. You also want to convince them. So you have to give them some things. You have to give them an enemy. And Mussolini is really clear about that. You have to give them an enemy. You have to give them a war. You have to give them a fight, because nothing unifies people like a good fight. And so, depending on who you were or who you've been, race, ethnicity, religion, those are really easy things to point at, to make, those are easy ways to make divisions between people and to fight, cause fights between people. Once you, and you also want to give your chosen population, whoever the chosen people are, once you've purified and expunged all the bad blood or bad whatever, then you want to make sure that you promise things to these people that are chosen. So, when you look at Nazi Germany, for the rank and file German, you got a lot of things. You got job security, you got socialized medicine, you got all those things. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But obviously there was this tremendous personal price that you paid for that in a lot of ways. But fascism is a political ideology, and it doesn't just take one form. Mussolini is who gave it its name and who described what he would consider the ideal fascist state. But there are lots of other organizations that might take on fascist overtones. And you have to distinguish that from white supremacy, because there are actually a lot of white supremacy movements, like in the United States, that they wouldn't necessarily like that. You know what I mean? It's like, and it depends on where they're coming from. It depends on whether they are esoteric Hitlerists, or it depends on whether they are, just people who align themselves with, I don't know, any of these weird groups that are espoused off Fox, or Trump. A lot of Trumpsters, if you were to actually explain this to them, they would not agree with Nazis or agree, with that, the classic definitions of fascism. And there are leftist organizations that can come uncomfortably close to that. I think of Stalin's Soviet Union as a great example, of Putin's Soviet Union, Putin's Russia, as a great example, great examples of, leftist organizations that are pushing really close to definitions of fascism. So, how does this work its way into the Paraweird stuff? Well, there are lots of elements of fascism in Paraweird. You've probably heard of William Pley. He was actually a very well-known screenwriter in the 1930s and 40s, political activist. He ran for president during the 1940s. He hated FDR, but he was an avid UFO investigator. He actually founded a Nazi UFO group called the Silver Shirts, and he was a Nazi sympathizer and a fascist from day one. So, he wrote a number of books. He's a very good writer. He actually won awards for his short stories prior to becoming all of this. He was imprisoned in 1942 because by that time we'd entered the war, but he was still a Nazi, a Hitler sympathizer. So he was sent to prison for, I don't know, 7 years or something for sedition, few years. I don't remember exactly how many. But his work is still out there. Then there's George Hunt Williamson, who is whose work, again, a neo-Nazi kind of dude, has written extensively about UFO contact, and some of his stuff has made its way into, the New Age community.
Right.
I mean, we can talk about the connections between, Alice Bailey's theosophy and the exteriorization of the esoteric hierarchy, as she calls it, and the occultist Schwaller de Lubitz, who is known for his Temple of Man series, but who was an avid anti-Semite. I mean, just terrifying anti-Semite. But his work, his occult work, has filtered into various places. I mean, it's all in there. It's not, you can draw straight lines, and it's not everybody, but it's been present enough over time that it is not surprising whatsoever that you have people in the Paraweird community. And face it, we're in, even though we're more mainstream than we used to be, we're still weird. Okay. We're still out there. So you're going to get a few out there people who are out there. And, it's just, they're multiply indexed in weird stuff. And so some of the weird stuff they're indexed in is fascism and white supremacy and other things. I mean, you can be multiply indexed it's not Frank, who is it? It's Homi Baba. You can be multiply indexed as I'm showing my critical studies credentials here. You can be multiply indexed as a subaltern, or you can be multiply indexed as a privileged white person. And so it shouldn't surprise us that, this kind of thing comes together. I think maybe it's because I'm older than dirt now, but I find that the younger folks, the 20s and 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, they're the ones that are startled by this. I'm like, I've been living with this my entire life. This is what I wrote my dissertation on 20 years ago. So yeah, it's still there. Bud Hopkins, God bless his dead name, and he was not a bad person, but he had this collection of, I don't know, 600, 700, 800 accounts of alien abduction. And when he was confronted with the fact that only like 4 or 5 of them, or a very tiny number, were of African American or non-white people, he was startled because it never occurred to him. And yet he was touting this as a universal narrative.
Sure.
Okay, his narrative of why, people are abducted, which of course talks about genetic material and how they want us. And we already know about the problems with David Jacobs. So it's, I mean, who I never cared for and go after intensely in my dissertation. It's like, hey, dude. But anyway, so, yeah, I completely get it. It doesn't surprise me that people get on it all the time. It's like, I see this.
Well, and I think, so I'm 39 and I don't know that I will speak to this idea of like being surprised, because I was definitely raised with this idea of, not that we're over racism or anything, because clearly, watching Barack Obama ascend and then watching the absolute frothing at the mouth, rabid hatred that was coming out of the right, it's like his policies are pretty close to your guy. I'm pretty sure there's one reason why you're angry about it, and it's his race. But this I think because I grew up also, again, in college, talking about queer theory, because I was in the, working in the women's studies department too. And this idea of intersectionalism, right? Understanding these things and then seeing these terms kind of hit the mainstream. And so I think there has been this glossing over of white supremacy and of virulent anti-Semitism in so many of these fields, this belief that we have moved past it. Again, this narrative of, oh, those people are dying out, people who are racist, people who are anti-Semitic, ableist, whatever. And so I not that I was necessarily surprised. I was surprised by how, again, I've been familiar also with Gamergate and things like that, where you have these alt-right spaces. Again, when I saw the ascendancy of the Tea Party, I knew this was trouble. So I've had an awareness of this kind of like alt 4chan nihilistic memery that's been going on.
These unhappy people who have to project their unhappiness.
Yes, exactly. And are looking to find power and are finding power in, like you say, with fascism, this need to have an enemy. And this is what I had emailed you about before, not understanding like, okay, this is an ideology that thrives on having an enemy. They always need new enemies. If one is eliminated, they find another one, right? And I think that's why like white supremacy and fascism and anti-Semitism, all these things end up blending together, because it's everybody else is the enemy. Everyone else who doesn't look like me, everyone else who doesn't think the way I do, they're the problem. They're the issue. And so it's, the part of it is a shock, but part of it is not. I think the shock is more that it is so insidious and that people are unaware of, again, the dog whistles, the subtlety, I guess. People seem to think, and I think I also thought too, that racism, anti-Semitism, people are pretty open about it if they really believe this kind of thing. But now the training of, we have to stay under the radar, and that's how we can better infiltrate, and also teaching them, okay, keep the worst things you believe to yourself until you get into these spaces, until you are respected in these spaces, and then you slowly start peeling back layers and to get people invested in the more nefarious aspects of your belief system.
It's exactly the same strategy that the religious right used in the 1970s and 1980s.
Right.
There was a book that was written way back, I think in 1980. It's been long out of print, but it's called Holy Terror, and it was basically a published series of, and this is before the internet, okay? So it's basically the authors doing exactly what you're not supposed to do as sociologists, but they weren't sociologists, they were journalists, so they didn't
sure.
Okay. Basically, they infiltrated themselves into organizational committees that were part of newly ascendant groups, religious right groups that were going to try to influence the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan. And so they were, they infiltrated groups that were part of the cabal, and it was basically a cabal that took over the Southern Baptist Convention, for example, in the 1970s, and part of and became part of the moral majority. Jerry Falwell's political organization in the early 1980s. And basically, what they did was they infiltrated these groups. They got all their memos, attached kind of a loose narrative, and published the whole thing. This is what these people are doing. This is what their goal for America is. This is before CPAC, okay? This is what these people's goal is. And really what it is, since a lot of these groups are from the South, the Deep South, I read it now and it's like, well, this is just a revenge of the South. These are people that are trying to take over, are trying to win the Civil War again. And they're just trying to do it a different way. And they're doing this, and one of the strategies was to try to infiltrate, as fundamentalists, try to infiltrate established Christian groups, mainstream groups like Presbyterians, Methodists, the American Baptists, Lutherans, etc. And even the Catholic Church to some degree, which of course for them is the big enemy. And they successfully did this. They caused schisms in those denominations, where various members of those denominations would develop a fundamentalist branch and would break, So all of these attempts, these evangelical, ecumenical attempts by a lot of larger mainstream Christian denominations, a lot of that effort was destroyed or seriously curtailed in the 1980s by these infiltration of this group. It's exactly the same strategy. You just make yourself over into something a little bit nicer. You don't reveal who you really are. You make these radical views seem rational.
Yes. Yeah.
And you can see that in the latest crop of the neo-Nazis, who complain because they start spouting their canard on the street corner and people punch them. I'm not going to tell anybody to punch anybody, but to me, there's no negotiating with a Nazi, because they are not interested in negotiation. They are interested in stopping discussion.
Exactly.
They're
Yes.
not interested in discussion.
Yes, they thrive on it. They also thrive on, again, it was so infuriating to watch the normalization of Richard Spencer, right? The cleaned up Nazi essentially, and this new face of the alt-right. However,
David Duke was the first person like that. People forget that he actually organized a major branch of the KKK. He was a Grand Duke of the KKK,
right?
And he did not reform. He just developed a nicer face. He did quit so he could run for office, but he did not reform.
Yes.
So
yeah, so this is and this too, because I think of this especially in terms of things like 4chan, where people are organizing. I mean, there are other organizations too, Order of Nine Angles, that are
I was just reading about them today.
There you go, exactly.
And you can get their books on Amazon. They're touting themselves as a mystical, esoteric order now.
I mean, anybody can basically call themselves that now, anyway. But just what I think that's why I wanted to talk to you so much, and why I want to release this, because I don't think people have an awareness of how organized they are, how agenda driven they are, and how willing they are to lie and gaslight you to have an appearance of they're not that bad, they're rational people, they just want to have a debate, they just want to have a conversation. And like you said, they're not actually interested in conversations, they're not interested in opinions or beliefs that are different than theirs. They have decided that what they want is right. All of us are corrupted. Again, you brought up the idea of the religious right. and my mother is evangelical, that idea of anything that isn't God is the devil, right? Anything that isn't their political ideology is corrupted, is dirty. Again, those are also code words for anti-Semitism that get wrapped up in all of this.
Well, there's a purity code, and that purity code can become either ideological purity, or it can very easily become blood purity. I mean, it's that's where that language comes from. It actually comes from this idea that it is possible for the blood to be tainted. I think ultimately, honestly, I think it comes from the idea of original sin. I will lay this at the
Yes.
feet of Christianity personally, because of a certain type of Christianity. Because if you have this idea that it's possible to be tainted, whether it's blood tainting or ideological tainting or spiritual tainting, then automatically there's this sense in which you have to be purified. And from there, the paranoia can grow. I mean, if you think about these are kind of like Gnostic myths. In Gnosticism, human beings are trapped by forces beyond us called the archons. We're trapped in this physical world, and we're struggling to find what our true essence is and who we are. And in certain types of Gnosticism, the body itself or certain ideas taint or make it difficult for your pure essence to ever really know what it is. I mean, ultimately, I think that a lot of these things are Gnostic myths, and in Gnosticism, you're constantly having to struggle with external forces that are trying to control you, and so it's like a war. It's a constant war that you're waging, and the war can be external or internal, and there's always an apocalypse. Now, part of the reason why I think that some of this stuff is continuing to generate itself, other than the fact that human beings have lost the ability to have new ideas, is that if you think about capitalism and socialism, Marxism and capitalism, both of those social political theories posit a kind of a heaven on earth in a weird sort of way. I mean, obviously with Marxism, you have the communist utopia. And in capitalism, you have this idea of perpetual progress, where eventually, I guess it will become like Star Trek and all of our needs will be met or something, even though somehow Star Trek transcends that, whatever. But Andrew Carnegie said it best, that wealth will do for us what God's kingdom could not, or Christ's kingdom could not. So, but the problem is that that's the end of history.
Right.
Okay, things end then, if that's the case. And obviously we don't have the end of history, and neither one of those political economic systems have worked. You know what I mean? Neither one of them have borne the promised fruit, right? So here we are left with this shit, in the middle of everything, and it's a mess. And the word anomie. We're in this anomie. We're in this mess, and some people are really, really, really looking for an answer that is simple, that will give them a sense of self, that will give them something they can commit to themselves to, a fight that they can identify with. And race is still, whatever race is still that. Culture is still that. Religion is still that. Even though a little bit of thinking will reveal how stupid that is. But if I'm on top of a blasted world, then who cares? And that's really what not the Order of Nine Angles says. They acknowledge that their activity is going to destroy the world, but they're going to be on top of it. So who cares? It's completely nihilistic. It's bizarre.
Yes.
And that's why they consider, groups like the Temple of Set and the Church of Satan to be enemies of theirs, because both of those organizations are all about advocate. Right? And just using your hedonistic impulses to actually sort of do a kind of real tantra at some level. You know what I mean? Kind of a Western version of that. But these people are like, screw this, fuck it, it's blowing up. And I'm like, okay, that's like really weird, but.
Well, okay, so again, getting back to your comment about original sin, because the way you're describing it to me, I hadn't thought about it that way before, but it's essentially that self-flagellation, but writ large, right? That I'm miserable.
I'm not worth it. I suck. It sucks.
It sucks, exactly. So since it sucks, it should be destroyed. And
the Messiah isn't coming, so fuck it.
Yes, literally.
Seriously. It's like, got to destroy the world in order to save it. It's no different than any fundamentalism. It's no different than, that's why fascism and fundamentalism find common purpose. Yes. They're both about, it all sucks, so whatever. You know what I mean?
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. It sucks. The human experience sucks. It's all bullshit. I also, as you were talking, thought about two different things. One, Tocqueville. I always think about like his writing after he visited early America, right? And the first time he comes
to Tocqueville.
No, because the first time he comes, it's like, this is great. Everything's amazing. You can make all these choices and do all these different things. And
Except
then
Americans have really rotten teeth because they eat too much bread. He says they have really rotten teeth. Oh God.
Exactly. But then after he spends some time here and goes back, he's like, wait a minute. They aren't actually free. There's this appearance of freedom, but it's only, again, I was thinking about what you were saying in terms of David Graeber, right? That idea of like, he's like, well, let's think of something else, that there's no, that seems kind of frowned upon, right? Like, oh, you get to have freedom, but within these prescribed ways of being free. And if you even talk about something outside of what we are selling to you as freedom, then again, you're like cast out, shunned, like they don't even know how to handle that.
Well, yeah. Well, and he does. It's not even that he says, let's try to think of something else. He just says, let's look at what other people did. Before the West decided it knew everything. It's, yes. What did other people do? How did other societies organize themselves? How did they handle these problems? Mm-hmm. Sometimes they didn't, sometimes they did. Now, his work is not perfect. Like, for example, in that book, because he clearly, when he's writing it, doesn't know about this stuff. There's a huge paucity of information about certain civilizations in Africa and certain civilizations in the Americas. And it's clear that he just doesn't know. Yeah. And in fact, in the last book that was written, some of that is addressed. Mm-hmm. So he can't talk about, the Haudenosaunee Great Law of Peace. He can't talk about the civilizations in Central and South America that had these very complex systems of both kind of like ownership, but also other ways in which people could interact with markets. He just doesn't have any of that. Mm-hmm. But those are things that you can address just by getting new information. The point is that even in the past that we know about, whether you're talking about Egypt or India or China, human beings have been organizing themselves in large entities for a long time. And some of these civilizations thought up really novel things, novel ways of approaching problems. The problem with Americans and the West is that if the problem isn't, if the solution isn't permanent and instant, we have no patience with going through the process. And that's a function of our technology. That's a function of our privilege of thinking that we need to have everything brought to us immediately or figure it out immediately. It's like, if we can't figure it out now, then screw it. Once again, screw it, because we certainly know how to shoot each other. You know, we certainly know how to commit acts of violence. We know how to do that. We'll do that. It's so bizarre, and I really think it's as a result of growing too quickly, not having a clear sense of why we're doing what we're doing. You know, even science does this. You know, it's like scientists, they're curious, but they will do certain types of activities or do certain types of experiments on people or with animals or just with the planet, that it's like, when you think about it afterwards, it's like, did you guys not think about that first? And they didn't, because they were just like, well, let's go and see what happens if we just, you know, there's a lot of dumb there.
Yeah. Well, and oh boy, I got so much that I want to say. Well, and again, talking about that anomie and how, you know, again, how fascism thrives, how white supremacy thrives in low trust societies. And there's so much going on. We have informational access to things that are going on around the globe. And the sense of overwhelm, the sense of lack of control, and what is our place in it? Where do we belong within it? And then, oh God, I think also, aside from, you know, technology kind of warping our sense of you know, again, this idea of instant gratification, I also think we've been done a huge disservice where people seem to think that social change just came from doing a couple protests and that was it. We don't really have that awareness of what protest culture looked like, what civil rights culture really looked like, and how it's years and decades of sustained action and deliberate action in order to make the changes that you want to see in the world. Somebody referenced something in contrast to the people protesting out of the Supreme Court, in front of the Supreme Court justices' houses. Well, as long as they peacefully protest. The Iraq War protest, millions of people were protesting in it, and they were peaceful. It's like, yeah, and they also did it on one day, and nothing, fuck all changed, right? Because whoever in charge knew, oh yeah, everybody just went back to work. Everybody just went back and lived their normal lives and thought that one declaration would somehow change the world. Like, again, there are no easy solutions. There are also no fast solutions to any of this. Part of the reason why, like you said, you know, these far-right groups have been infiltrating various religious movements, various political movements. Again, they're being taught to run for office and be a part of this. So they're getting laws changed. They're going to get Roe overturned, right? Like, right. We just have been, again, I think, like, speaking to like my age and younger, that complacency of like, well, this is how the world is, not realizing like this is the world that was fought for, and right. And you have to keep fighting if you want it to continue the right. way you want it.
Well, I think both the right and the left, though, operate. There is an American idea that if you pass a law, and the right believes this too. I mean, if you pass a law, that automatically fixes whatever is supposed to be fixed. And the left is wrong about that, and the right is wrong about that. And the reason we know that is because of the experiences of the founding fathers. And I always like to go back to the founding fathers, not because I agree with them so much, but because their whole process of establishing the nation, because the nation, the United States as a national entity, was established, at least in a European sense, was established in a completely different way than any other nation had ever been established up to that point. And it was an attempt to create a nation based essentially on 3 pieces of paper that was completely theoretical. And so they just said, well, but they had this weird, rationalist idea that somehow it would work. So they just sort of launched it, And of course, it didn't work like that at first. And so eventually, at first it was a confederacy, and after the revolution, and that didn't work. And so then they had to come up with the Constitution, and it was hard to get people to sign on to the Constitution. In fact, I live in New York, and New York was one of the last states to sign on to the Constitution. And I think there was like a deal that was done, in order to do that. But even then, it was sort of, in the beginning, they understood that it was a process, I think that they did understand that it was imperfect and that it was a process, and that especially we know that in Europe, the French, for example, they didn't think this was going to last for more than 20 years, so they were like waiting at every opportunity for something to happen. But there's a lesson there. But there's another lesson. I was just thinking of this as you were talking. Hold on. I have to pull something off my shelf.
I do. I love it.
This is actually a book I've been working through. And we can sort of use this as a book of contrasts. All right. This is a book called The Gantawissis, Iroquois Women by Barbara Alice-Mann, who is one of she probably is one of the premier historians of the Haudenosaunee people, specifically the Seneca. But what this book is about is it's a history. It's the only history like this that has ever been written. It's a history about the Iroquois Confederacy, or the Haudenosaunee, as they refer to themselves, Confederacy, which was a political entity that existed when settlers arrived in North America. And it's the history of this, and it's taken not only from oral sources, obviously, but it's also taken from archaeological sources, what archaeology has shown, and it also is taken from the Confederacy continued to exist for quite a while until after the Revolutionary War, and in fact, actually, it still does exist. It's just not organized in quite the way that it was originally, and what it's trying to be like the Cayugas and the Oneidas are trying to reestablish traditional clan hierarchies in here in the Finger Lake areas in New York State, and it's caused some real problems because there are some Cayugas that are hooked up with the state of New York, and they don't want to do that, and others that are more traditional that want to go back, rematriate, they say, because the thing about the Haudenosaunee is that it was a system in which men and women had equal power, and this was a process that evolved over time. It was not something that just occurred because, the Haudenosaunee are so enlightened. And they talk about this. Essentially, the Haudenosaunee have a fairly extensive history, but what led to this particular type of political confederacy was that they were heavily involved with the Mississippian cult, which was the third wave, if you will, of a series of cults that came up from Mexico and Central America, bringing new agricultural technology. First it brought maize, and then it brought other kinds of things. But with this technology, with these new types of agricultural technologies, these technologies were linked to cults, obviously, and different political practices. Some indigenous peoples in North America accepted them, some did not. Some, or accepted different aspects of them. So the Seneca in particular became very involved with the Mississippian culture or their version of it in the Ohio Valley and up through the Great Lakes. And it eventually led to a situation where you have a priestly elite who's kind of lording it over everybody else. I mean, this sounds familiar. This is the story they tell. A priestly elite who is lording over everybody else, who's forcing other people to grow corn and other agricultural products, but they aren't permitted to use or eat them themselves. They have to send it to these priestly temples, those big temples that they have in Ohio. And eventually what ended up happening is that people got pissed off about it. And the person who's credited with starting the rebellion that led to a civil war is a woman who's called, her name became a title, Jagansasa. And she started a rebellion. She said, screw this. I need to feed my family. I need to feed my village. And they started doing this, and it led to a civil war, a huge civil war that led to, cannibalism and all kinds of stuff, which they talk about very openly in their oral tradition. But what ended up happening eventually is that, and this is also a religious story, but what happened eventually is that an individual who in the tradition is called the peacemaker. He has a title, which I'm not going to utter because if you're not Haudenosaunee, you're not supposed to say it. But he's called the peacemaker. He's sort of a messianic figure in a way. But basically, he with assistance, I mean, this is a whole long story, he develops an idea about how to join. It's essentially a kind of federalism. It's a political vision that he has about how to stop this civil war and bring together the different Haudenosaunee Iroquois nations into one people. But the only way this can be accomplished is not in any kind of top-down way, but he has to go and make peace with those people who started the Civil War out of rebellion, because he has to convince them, the women particularly, he has to convince them that this isn't just another form of hierarchy. This isn't just another form of elitism. So there's this really interesting melding that occurs between an older, more matricentric, village-oriented order with this political religious vision, spiritual vision, I guess, really, that the peacemaker has. And over time, and it took centuries, over time, there developed this very cohesive political order in which men and women shared vertical power. And through their clans, their different clans, that's more of a horizontal power, you know what I mean? But for example, you did have, and as a sociologist, you would appreciate this, they did have sort of gender divided roles, although those roles were considered to be equal. But women were considered to have sort of the final veto power over issues of war or issues of economic importance that would affect the nation as a whole, or the different peoples as a whole, because they were responsible for the children and for agriculture. So it was like, they're responsible for the resources. And the reason why the women were given this responsibility is because in these elite Mississippian cultures, it was men who had that authority. And as one Mohawk elder told me, this is what he told me, your listeners can decide whether this is true or not, is that men are crazy. Men are not rational when it comes to power. That's what he said. Men are not rational when it comes to power. They seek their own gain. They forget about their children. They forget about a larger view. And at least in Haudenosaunee thinking, it's women who, as a group, who seem to have the ability to think more, in that way, more globally. And so, but it's not that men don't have certain levels of authority. They do. There's like a council where they meet, and they are representatives. The men are the representatives for the different nations. And so but the point is that it took a long time to hammer this out. And there are rituals involved with this. There's a ritual called the consolation ritual or ceremony, which is a ritual that when you have two warring parties who cannot agree, they get together and they do a consolation ritual where they agree to disagree and coexist without harming each other, and just deal with that tension.
Mm-hmm.
to see whether, because down the line something may change, and they know that down the line something may change. There's this Jewish Talmudic idea that you have to have discord a little bit. You have to have arguments. You have to have discussion, because you can't always agree. Because if you can hold that tension, you're having a debate for the sake of heaven. Because whatever life is, whatever love is bigger than any of our little iterations of it. So you have to create a space in which these oppositions can exist without being solved automatically.
Mm-hmm.
And that somehow just that space alone can create a new reality that will permit these other things to be solved down the line. I mean, there's a great deal of faith and hope in that, but I think that ultimately, at their best, the best expression of that is what people like Thomas Jefferson hoped for.
Thank you so much for listening and or watching, depending on where you found this podcast. I'm going to link in the description to Professor WHAM's website. I'm also going to link 2 different YouTube videos where she was a guest and really got into fascism in the occult, coded symbols used in like these alt-right heathen spaces, and other tools that you can use to help you inform yourself and identify what is happening and what is intentionally happening under our noses, so that we don't call it out. If you want to follow Personal Pans, you can find me on Twitter and on Instagram at Personal Pans. I'm perpetually on Twitter at Kali Butterfly. That's K-A-L-I Butterfly. Yeah, obviously, have a playful, have a curious day, and also be really vigilant, because fascism has been making its march into Paraweird spaces for decades, and it's not going to stop unless we fight it for as long as we have to.